The following Sunday, Brooke set the dining room as if nothing had happened, the silver polished, the prime rib resting beneath a silver dome, every chair filled except the one she had once denied me. But this time, before anyone lifted a fork, my attorney stood beside me and slid a thin leather folder across the table. Daniel looked confused until he saw his late father's trust, amended years earlier, naming me sole controller of the property, the investment accounts, and the family business shares Brooke had been quietly trying to leverage for loans she was never authorized to seek. Her face changed when my attorney produced copies of the forged occupancy paperwork she had submitted to a senior placement broker, along with emails mocking me as a burden while plotting to move me out before the house could be transferred. The room went silent except for the grandfather clock in the hall. I let that silence do its work. Then I told Daniel the truth I had protected him from too long. Brooke had used his name on financial disclosures, misrepresented family assets, and nearly triggered fraud exposure that could have cost him everything. His hands shook as he read. Brooke reached for explanations, for misunderstandings, for the practiced sweetness she wore like perfume, but every word collapsed under documents, signatures, timestamps. There was nowhere left for deceit to hide. Then came the final page, the one Brooke never imagined existed. Under the trust's conduct clause, any heir or spouse found attempting elder coercion or intentional humiliation resulting in documented harm was disqualified from inheritance benefits and removed from governance rights. Her share vanished in a single paragraph. Access revoked. Claims extinguished. The room seemed smaller somehow. Daniel pushed back from the table and looked at me the way a son should have looked years earlier. Not with pity, with shame. Brooke whispered this couldn't be legal. My attorney answered calmly that it had already been filed. Then the brokerage representative I had invited spoke next. The credit lines Brooke opened using assumed authority were frozen pending civil review. The country club board, where she chaired a charity gala, had also received notice after the broker complaint surfaced. By Monday, she resigned before they could remove her publicly. By Wednesday, the luxury SUV lease she bragged about was surrendered. By Friday, she had moved into a furnished apartment paid from her own remaining savings because she had none of the life she had been building on my back. I did not raise my voice once. I only turned to Daniel and handed him a folded linen napkin.
"Set another place," I said.
He looked at the old head chair at the table, the one his father always insisted was mine, and with trembling hands he pulled it out for me. I sat there while Brooke stood frozen beside the wall, no longer hostess, no longer gatekeeper, no longer the woman who thought a TV tray and a laundry room had made me small. Then I lifted the silver dome myself and served the prime rib. To everyone, including me. And before the meal began, I looked at Brooke one last time and said, "The woman you sent to eat beside the washing machine owns this house, controls this table, and decides who belongs at it. You confused courtesy with surrender. That was your mistake." Months later, the laundry room became a butler's pantry in a renovation I funded myself. The little folding TV tray remained in a corner, untouched because I kept it as a reminder. Not of humiliation, of reversal. Daniel repaired what he could.
Slowly. Properly.
And every Sunday after that, family dinner began only when I sat at the head of the table. No one questioned it. No one dared. The last time I heard Brooke's name was when someone mentioned she told friends she lost everything over a dinner seat. They were wrong. She lost everything because she believed dignity could be taken from a woman who had spent a lifetime building the very roof over their heads. She learned too late that exile works both ways. She sent me to the laundry room for supper. I sent her out of my house for good. "Since there isn't room at the table," my daughter-in-law said, balancing a folding TV tray in her hands, "you can eat in the laundry room." I remember those words more clearly than I remember my own wedding vows. The smell of roasted prime rib filled the house that Sunday, rich and buttery, drifting from Brooke's kitchen while the family gathered around the long oak table my late husband and I bought in 1983 from a furniture maker outside Columbus. I had polished that table myself for decades. Thanksgivings, Christmases, graduations, every blessing our family ever celebrated had rested on its scarred old surface. That afternoon, I arrived carrying a pecan pie still warm from my oven, the kind Daniel used to beg for when he was a boy. Brooke kissed the air beside my cheek, never touching me, then took the pie without thanks. Everyone else had linen napkins, crystal glasses, heavy china plates. I noticed there were 6 place settings, though 7 of us had been invited. At first, I thought there had been some mistake. Maybe a chair was missing from storage. Maybe she planned to squeeze another place in. But then Brooke opened the laundry room door with one manicure hand and gestured toward a little folding tray set beside the dryer, a paper napkin already waiting. She said it lightly, almost playfully, as if she were offering me some special accommodation. Daniel laughed under his breath, not looking at me. My grandson kept scrolling on his phone. No one spoke. In families, silence can be louder than cruelty. I stood there holding my purse, hearing the ice clink in water glasses at the dining table while the dryer hummed beside my designated seat. I was 68 years old and had just been seated next to detergent bottles while strangers I had once rocked as babies carved beef at my family table. Something cold passed through me then, colder than anger. Not humiliation exactly. Recognition. Because this was not the first little exile. It was simply the first one too deliberate to excuse. I smiled. I thanked Brooke for thinking of me, and I carried my plate into the laundry room myself. The tray rattled slightly under the weight of the china. Through the half-open door, I could hear Brooke describing the horseradish sauce, everyone laughing as though they were at some magazine-perfect dinner. I cut a bite of meat, already lukewarm, and looked at the washing machine where a sock had been left draped. Over the lid. Funny what the mind remembers in moments when the heart is breaking. A single white sock. The scent of bleach. The faint vibration of the dryer. I thought of my husband Frank, and what he would have done if he'd seen me there. He would have pulled a chair beside me and made the laundry room feel like the head of the table. But Frank had been gone 6 years, and grief teaches you some insults arrive dressed as convenience. Halfway through the meal, Brooke appeared in the doorway, smiling sweetly. "Isn't this cozier for you?" she asked. I looked up at her and for the first time truly saw not a difficult daughter-in-law, but a woman testing how much of me could be erased. I said only, "It's very memorable." She mistook that for surrender. That was her first mistake. After dinner, I carried my own plate to the sink before Brooke could perform another kindness for show. She thanked everyone for coming as if she had hosted a flawless evening, and Daniel kissed her cheek while discussing mortgage rates with his brother, as though nothing unusual had happened at all. That unsettled me more than the tray had. Cruelty can shock you once, but indifference settles deeper. Driving home through the dark Ohio suburbs, I kept the radio off. Streetlights passed across the windshield in slow gold bands, and each one seemed to illuminate some old memory I had dismissed for years. The Christmas Brooke claimed there was no room for one more at their ski cabin, though I later saw family photos online showing an empty guest room. The Easter she moved my place card to the children's folding table and laughed that I would have more fun there. The time she told the realtor in front of me that older people often downsize before they become a burden. I had treated each insult like weather. Temporary. Explainable. But that night they began arranging themselves into a pattern too precise to ignore. When I reached home, my little ranch house felt unusually still. Frank's old reading lamp cast a soft circle across the den. His leather chair sat where it always had, angled toward the fireplace. I stood there with my coat still on and whispered aloud, "What have I been pretending not
To see?
The next morning I found myself polishing silver that did not need polishing. Grief has odd rituals, and worry has its own. My hands kept moving while my mind circled Brooke's expression in the laundry doorway, not mocking exactly, but measuring. As if she had been testing how much exclusion I would absorb without protest. 2 days later, Margaret Collins called. Margaret had known me since high school and possessed the kind of blunt loyalty age does not soften. She asked how Sunday dinner went. I said, "Fine, just family things." There was a pause. Then she said, "Evelyn, I saw Brooke at the bank last month asking questions about reverse mortgages and elder transition communities." My hand froze around the dish towel. I laughed at first because the alternative felt too ugly. Brooke would never. Margaret did not laugh. She said, "Honey, Women do not ask how quickly title transfers happen after assisted living placement unless they are thinking ahead. After we hung up, I sat at the kitchen table staring at Frank's old checkbook register, the one I still used for household notes, though everything was online now. My name was on the deed. My name was on more things than Daniel likely understood. Frank had been meticulous, protective in ways I only began appreciating after he was gone. For the first time, a different thought entered my mind, one so calm it frightened me. What if Brooke was not simply humiliating me? What if she was preparing to move me out of my own story? That afternoon, Daniel called, unusually cheerful, asking if I had ever considered a senior living community with activities and meal service. His tone was casual, rehearsed almost. I looked out the window at the maple Frank planted when Daniel turned 10, its branches brushing the porch roof. Then I heard myself answer sweetly, I may be open to discussing it. There was relief in his silence before he spoke again. Too much relief. When we hung up, I folded the dish towel, set it down carefully, and understood something with startling clarity. They believed I was old enough to be managed, fragile enough to be moved, grateful enough not to question. I let them believe all of it. Some reversals begin not with confrontation, but with consent that is only performance. For the next 2 weeks, I played the role they had quietly written for me. I asked Daniel innocent questions about retirement communities. I let Brooke recommend brochures with smiling gray-haired couples playing pickleball under impossible sunshine. I even toured one place 30 miles outside town where a young coordinator showed me a one-bedroom unit with beige carpeting and spoke in a voice people use when they think age has made you simple. I nodded through all of it, collecting information while appearing overwhelmed. Brooke was pleased in a way she tried to hide.
That pleased me.
Predators grow careless when they believe prey has accepted its fate. But while they plan my soft removal, I began looking backward. Really looking. I opened old file boxes Frank kept in the hall closet and found what I should have studied years earlier. Deed records, trust amendments, partnership statements from the small industrial supply business Frank sold before his death. Notes in his slanted handwriting. Evelyn retains full residential authority during her lifetime. No transfer without express consent. Reading those words felt like hearing his voice through paper. Protective.
Precise.
Not sentimental. Frank had not trusted chance where family and money could collide. One afternoon, Margaret drove over with coffee and sat at my kitchen table while I spread documents between sugar packets and coasters. She read quietly, then looked up and said, "Honey, they do not know what they are touching." That same week, Brooke hosted book club at her house and invited me only after Daniel insisted. I went. Sometimes truth arrives dressed as accident. While fetching teacups from the butler pantry, I heard Brooke in the next room telling a friend, "Once Evelyn settles into assisted living, we can finally redo the kitchen and open up the dining room." Her friend asked whether Daniel was comfortable pushing his mother out. Brooke laughed softly and said, "Daniel hates conflict. He follows the path I clear." I stood there holding china, perfectly still. There are moments when betrayal stops being wound and becomes evidence. I made no sound. I returned with the tea tray and smiled through lemon bars while Brooke complimented my cardigan. That night, I slept better than I had in months. Certainty can be strangely restful. The following Monday, I made an appointment with Frank's estate attorney, Leonard Price, a man in his 70s who still wore suspenders and remembered every clause he had drafted. His office smelled faintly of paper and cedar. He listened without interruption while I described the dinner, the senior living suggestions, Brooke's comments. Then he opened the trust and tapped one paragraph with a fountain pen. "Conduct clause," he said. "Your husband insisted on it. Any heir attempting coercion, fraudulent influence, or deliberate elder humiliation affecting residents' rights can be disqualified." I looked at him to be sure I had heard correctly. He adjusted his glasses and added, "Frank was a loving man, Mrs. Harper, but he was not naive." My pulse did something odd then, not fear exactly, but awakening. Leonard suggested patience. Documentation. Let conduct reveal itself fully. "Do not interrupt people while they are making mistakes," he said. "Let them complete them." When I arrived home, there was a voicemail from Daniel asking whether I liked a brochure Brooke had mailed over featuring a facility with crafts and transportation. I listened twice before deleting it. Then I stood in the dining room of my own home, ran my fingers over the oak table Frank and I bought all those years ago, and understood the shape of what was coming. Brooke believed she was moving me toward the exit. In truth, she had begun walking toward her own. Spring moved in slowly that year, the kind of Midwestern spring where rain lingers in the gutters and everything smells of thawing earth. Brooke announced she would host Easter dinner and insisted it be a grand family occasion. She sounded almost tender when she invited me, which made me more cautious, not less. False warmth often arrives before an ambush. I offered to bring my pecan pie again. She said she already had dessert covered. Her voice carried that smoothness I had begun to recognize as strategy. 2 days before Easter, Daniel stopped by unexpectedly, carrying brochures and a potted lily. He wandered through my kitchen, making too much small talk before finally saying Brooke had found a lovely senior community with immediate openings, and perhaps I should consider getting on a wait list. I poured coffee as if discussing weather and said maybe after Easter we could talk. He looked visibly relieved. I noticed that now, how often my compliance calmed him. It told me more than resistance ever could. On Easter Sunday, I arrived wearing the pale blue suit Frank always liked, the one I had nearly given to Goodwill after his funeral. Brooke had set the dining room beautifully. Silver chargers, white tulips, name cards handwritten in looping script. Mine was there this time, though not at the table center where Frank and I always sat, but near the far end beside the hallway. Improvement by inches can still be insult. During appetizers, Brooke made a show of complimenting my resilience to the guests. Evelyn is adjusting so bravely to all the changes ahead, she said, emphasizing changes. A neighbor asked what changes. Brooke smiled and replied, "We are helping her think about next steps before the house becomes too much." She said it as though discussing weatherproofing. I buttered a roll and said nothing. Let people reveal themselves fully. Leonard's advice stayed with me. Midway through dinner, Brooke raised a glass and proposed a toast to making practical decisions for every generation, she said, then glanced at me with that tiny triumphant smile. My grandson looked uncomfortable. Daniel stared at his plate. And in that instant I understood Brooke had grown bolder. Public humiliation no longer needed laundry rooms. It could wear crystal stemware. After dinner, she cornered me in the kitchen while guests lingered over coffee. "I found a wonderful assisted living campus," she said in a lowered voice. "Once you settle in, Daniel and I can help oversee the house." The house. Not my house. The house. Possession had already shifted in her imagination. I touched her wrist lightly and answered with almost grandmotherly softness, "You have thought this through." Her smile widened, taking that for surrender. Then something happened she did not expect. Margaret, who had arrived late, stepped into the kitchen doorway and heard enough to understand. She looked at Brooke and said, sharper than carving steel, "Some women mistake hospitality for inheritance." Brooke laughed awkwardly, but color had risen in her face. That night after guests left, I drove home with Easter lilies beside me in the passenger seat and a steadiness I had not felt in years. Brooke had overplayed her hand in front of witnesses. Humiliation had become documented conduct. The next morning, Leonard called after reviewing additional trust language and suggested we begin preserving evidence. Save messages. Note dates. Let the pattern speak. When I hung up, I opened a fresh legal pad and wrote at the top in neat block letters, "Acts of exclusion." Then I listed the laundry room dinner first. Beneath it I wrote Easter toast. I had stopped thinking of these as wounds. They were now entries. And somewhere between the second line and the third, I realized I was no longer enduring Brooke's campaign. I was preparing its ending. By May I had grown almost grateful for Brooke's impatience, because ambition in a hurry leaves fingerprints. She began texting Daniel in ways she assumed I would never see, but sons raised by practical mothers have careless habits. One afternoon, he left his phone on my kitchen counter while helping me move patio chairs before a storm. A message lit the screen before I could look away. "If your mother delays much longer, We may lose the contractor slot for the renovation. Renovation. Not if she moves. When she moves. Daniel returned before I could say a word, but I did not need more. The language had changed from suggestion to planning. That same week Leonard asked me to come downtown because he had found something troubling. In his office, he slid across copies of inquiry forms submitted to a senior transition brokerage. My name, my address, medical assumptions that were false. Contact person listed as Brooke Harper. I stared so long at the page Leonard quietly asked if I was all right. I was not hurt. I was sharpened. He explained no placement could occur without my consent, but the submission itself mattered because it showed intent. Then he pointed to something stranger. A preliminary home valuation request had also been made from Brooke's email regarding resale potential after elder relocation. There it was. Not concern. Strategy. I thought of all the Sundays she had served me pie while measuring square footage in her mind. When I got home, I sat on the porch until dusk and watched swallows dip over the lawn Frank used to mow in diagonal rows. Betrayal has stages.
Shock, grief.
Then sometimes a cold confidence. I had entered the third. The next Sunday Brooke called, sugary as ever, asking whether I might host a small family luncheon because she wanted everyone together to discuss supportive options. I agreed at once. Too quickly, perhaps because she paused as if surprised. She expected resistance. Instead, I said I would make pot roast and use the good china. Her voice brightened. She thought she had arranged an intervention. I was arranging a stage. Before that luncheon, Leonard helped me place temporary monitoring alerts on the trust assets and property records. Quiet safeguards. Invisible fences. He also suggested we invite an old family friend, Robert Jenkins, retired banker and former executor witness, someone Daniel respected. I called Robert myself. He listened without interruption, then said, Evelyn, your husband prepared for storms. Maybe he knew one would wear pearls. I laughed harder than I had in months. On luncheon day, Brooke arrived carrying flowers and the expression of a woman rehearsing benevolence. Daniel looked nervous. Robert came 10 minutes later, claiming he was in the neighborhood. During coffee, Brooke began gently raising the burden of home maintenance, then shifted toward assisted living, as though unveiling compassion. She had nearly completed her performance when Robert asked, almost casually, whether Daniel understood his mother's trust structure prevented occupancy transfer absent her direction. Daniel frowned. Brooke's smile faltered only a fraction, but I saw it. Robert continued speaking about fiduciary risk and elder coercion statutes in the same tone one might discuss whether. Brooke set down her cup. Too hard against the saucer. Tiny sound. Huge meaning. Something in the room changed. Daniel looked from Robert to me as if seeing an unfamiliar map. Brooke moved quickly to recover, insisting everyone wanted what was best for me. I answered softly, of course. That is why transparency matters. It was not a confrontation, not yet. But as they left, Brooke hugged me with stiff arms and whispered, You are making this more complicated than it needs to be. I smiled and said, Some things only look complicated when they are hidden. Her eyes met mine then, and for the first time I saw uncertainty. Not fear, but its first cousin. That night I added 2 more entries to my legal pad. Fraud inquiry forms. Luncheon witness reaction. Then I underlined a sentence Frank once used when negotiating contracts, a line I suddenly understood in my bones. When people rush toward what they think they own, they often expose what they never had. June brought heat thick enough to make the porch screens hum with cicadas, and with it came Brooke's next mistake. People under pressure often confuse retreat with regrouping. After the luncheon, she grew quieter for a few weeks, almost gracious, which made Daniel hopeful and Margaret suspicious. Then one Tuesday Leonard called and asked whether I had authorized any amendment review requests. I had not. Someone using Brooke's office address had requested copies of trust summaries through a junior clerk, likely hoping to understand what protections existed. It was denied, of course, but Leonard sounded almost impressed. She is escalating, he said. I thanked him and wrote another line on the legal pad. Escalation often precedes collapse. 2 days later, Brooke invited me to lunch at a country club she had recently joined through one of her charity boards. She wore cream linen and spoke with unusual softness, asking about Frank, about my garden, even complimenting the blue pendant Daniel gave me years ago. Then, over chicken salad and iced tea, she leaned forward and said she had been thinking perhaps Daniel and I should simplify everything now, before emergencies force hard decisions. She slid a folder across the table. Not legal papers, just summaries she had typed herself, suggesting I could sign over property management authority for convenience. Convenience. Such a polite word for surrender. I did not touch the folder. Instead, I smiled and asked whether she often drafted estate ideas between charity luncheons. She laughed, but a flush crept up her neck. I told her I would consider it. Again, she mistook restraint for uncertainty. That evening, I took the folder straight to Leonard. He read every page in silence, then removed his glasses and said, "This is not merely presumptuous. It edges toward attempted undue influence." Hearing those words spoken aloud changed something in me. Until then, I had framed Brooke as cruel, manipulative, ambitious. Now the behavior had legal names. Names carry weight. Leonard suggested one final measure before formal action: allow Brooke enough rope to show intent publicly and financially, then close every gate at once. It sounded almost theatrical. It was also wise. Meanwhile, Daniel began calling more often, uneasy in ways he did not understand. Once he asked whether Brooke had offended me at lunch. I said only, "Your wife is very interested in my future." He laughed nervously, then changed the subject. But doubt had entered him. I could hear it in pauses. At month's end, Brooke hosted a summer fundraising dinner and asked me to attend because several civic donors admired our family story. I almost declined, then realized opportunity had arrived dressed in pearls again. At the dinner, I overheard Brooke telling a donor she hoped soon to oversee a major home renovation, once family transitions settle. The donor, not knowing I stood behind them, asked whether she already owned the property. Brooke answered, "Practically speaking, yes." Practically speaking. Such revealing little phrases. I said nothing there. I did not need to. 2 witnesses later repeated the comment to Margaret unprompted. Evidence had begun walking toward me on its own. That weekend, Leonard helped prepare formal notices freezing unauthorized asset inquiries and drafted contingency letters to the brokerage, the bank, and one more place he did not explain yet. For timing, he said. I trusted him. On Sunday, I opened Frank's old cedar chest and found the photograph from our first year in the house, both of us standing beside the oak dining table before Daniel was born. Frank's hand rested on the chair that would one day become my seat of reckoning. I traced the photo edge and realized revenge was too crude a word for what was forming. This was restoration. Brooke still believed she was negotiating control. She did not yet understand the game had changed. Control was no longer what she might gain. It was what she was about to lose. By late July, the heat pressed against the windows even after sundown, and everything in me had grown quieter, sharper, almost ceremonial. Leonard called one morning and said simply, "It is time you know everything." In his office, he opened a separate binder I had never seen, one Frank had instructed him to release only if family coercion ever emerged. Inside were trust provisions beyond what I knew, including a sealed governance letter naming me sole lifetime authority over not only the house, but reserve investment holdings Daniel believed had long been liquidated. Frank had not sold everything after all. He had converted a substantial portion into protected instruments outside ordinary inheritance assumptions. I sat back in the leather chair and laughed softly, not from amusement, but from the strange comfort of discovering your dead husband had anticipated the character of the living. Leonard tapped another clause and said if evidence of elder manipulation became public within family proceedings, not only could a spouse lose inheritance expectations, but any attempt to use marital standing for indirect control could trigger disqualification review. I asked whether Brooke understood any of this. He smiled. Judging by her behavior, not remotely. Driving home, I felt something I had not allowed myself in months. Advantage. Not hope. Advantage. That afternoon, Daniel stopped by unannounced. He looked worn, older somehow, and stood in my kitchen turning a coffee mug in his hands before finally asking whether Brooke had ever spoken to me about refinancing. My pulse did not show in my voice. Why do you ask?
He hesitated then.
Admitted he had noticed applications related to a home equity proposal he never authorized fully, and Brooke had brushed it off as planning. There it was. The first crack in his certainty. I did not rush to fill the silence. Instead I said, Daniel, sometimes the person clearing your path is leading you somewhere.
He stared at me a long time.
For the first time in years, he looked less like Brooke's husband than my son. That weekend, Brooke announced a Labor Day dinner at her house, larger than usual, with extended relatives and 2 business acquaintances of Daniel's. A fresh start gathering, she called it. Leonard, when I told him, leaned back and said, then that may be our proper forum. We began preparing not for confrontation, but for revelation. He assembled copies of the brokerage inquiries, the trust conduct clause, the false placement submission, even notes from the fundraiser witnesses. Robert agreed to attend as though socially invited. Margaret nearly looked disappointed there would be no shouting. Dignity lands harder, I told her. In the days before the dinner, Brooke sent me oddly cheerful messages about where I should sit and what dessert to bring. The irony nearly made me smile. On the morning of the gathering, I opened my legal pad and saw 7 pages of entries. What began with a folding tray beside a dryer had become a ledger of motive. I tucked the pad into my handbag. Insurance. At Brooke's house that evening, the dining room glowed with candles and polished silver. The same long oak table sat dressed almost ceremonially, and for one flicker of a moment, I remembered the laundry room door and how small she believed she had made me there. Brooke greeted guests with the bright composure of a woman certain she controlled the room. During cocktails, she touched my elbow and whispered, I put you closer to the center tonight. I answered, how thoughtful. She heard gratitude. I meant prophecy. Then, as everyone moved toward dinner, Robert arrived carrying a leather folio under one arm. Brooke's smile tightened when she saw it, just enough for me to notice. Tiny signs tell entire stories. Daniel noticed too. I saw it in the way he followed Robert. With his eyes. Something electric moved beneath ordinary conversation then. The way air changes before a storm reaches the porch. Brooke still believed the evening was hers to host. She did not yet understand it had become a hearing. And as I took my seat, not at the far end but near the head of the table, I felt for the first time that Frank was not absent from this fight at all. He had simply been waiting in the fine print. The first course had barely been cleared when Brooke lifted her wine glass and tapped it lightly for attention. Conversation softened. Candlelight flickered against crystal. She wore the expression of someone about to deliver benevolence as performance. Before dessert, she said, I want to say how much family means when we make practical choices for one another. That word again. Practical. She went on speaking about generations, transitions, support, each sentence dressed in concern and aimed like a blade wrapped in linen. Then she turned toward me before the room and said, Evelyn has been so brave considering a simpler arrangement for this next season of life. There it was. Public framing. Not suggestion now, but narrative. Several guests smiled politely, unaware they were being invited to witness an erasure. I folded my napkin and placed it beside my plate. Leonard, seated 3 chairs down as if merely another old friend, did not move. Robert sipped water and watched. Daniel looked stricken. Brooke mistook his discomfort for shared tension. She continued, even bolder, saying she and Daniel hoped to preserve the family home for the children, as though stewardship had already changed hands. The room had grown so quiet I could hear ice settle in someone's glass. Then Robert set down his fork and asked, almost conversationally, Brooke, when you refer to preserving the family home, do you mean the property governed under Evelyn Harper's sole trust authority? Brooke blinked once. A tiny pause. Enough. She laughed and said of course everything would be handled as a family. Leonard opened the leather folio. Even now no one raised a voice. That was the beauty of it. Dignity can sound almost gentle while dismantling deceit. Leonard said, He had been asked by Mrs. Harper to clarify certain assumptions before misunderstandings hardened. He placed copies on the table nearest Daniel. Trust clauses. Inquiry forms. The senior placement submission bearing Brooke's contact details. Daniel stared as color drained from his face. Brooke reached toward the papers too quickly, then stopped. "This is absurd," she said, but the practiced smoothness had cracked. Leonard read aloud one section concerning coercive conduct and inheritance disqualification. The words did not thunder. They settled. He then referenced the unauthorized valuation request and financial inquiry records. One of Daniel's business associates, a banker, quietly asked Brooke whether she had submitted those forms without ownership standing. It was the wrong question for her to hear in front of witnesses. She began explaining, then over-explaining. People reveal guilt not in denial, but in excess. Margaret spoke next, not loudly, only clearly. "You seated this woman in a laundry room and called it kindness. Do not dress greed as caregiving now." Silence after that had weight. Daniel looked at Brooke with a bewilderment so raw, it almost made me grieve. "Did you do this?" he asked. She answered with fragments. "For us. For the future. For the house." Every phrase worse than the last. Then Leonard slid forward the final page Frank had left dormant all these years. Conduct breach review triggered. Conditional rights suspended pending civil findings. Brooke actually whispered, "You cannot do this at dinner." I looked at her and said, "You began this at dinner." No one moved for several seconds. Then Daniel pushed back his chair and stood, not in anger, but in dawning ruin. The hostess who once assigned me exile beside a dryer now stood exposed at her own table, undone not by revenge, but by documents, witnesses, and her own appetite. Dessert remained untouched. Prime rib cooled under silver domes. And somewhere in that charged stillness, I understood the balance had tipped. Brooke was no longer managing perceptions. She was answering for conduct. But the deepest turn had not yet come, because what Daniel would learn after the guests left would cost Brooke far more than embarrassment. After the guests left, no one touched the pie. Half-filled glasses stood abandoned along the table like evidence after trial. Brooke moved through the dining room gathering plates with rigid motions, as though ordinary chores could restore ordinary life. They could not. Daniel remained seated, elbows on the table, staring at the documents Leonard had left behind. I had seen my son angry before in small domestic ways, over traffic or taxes or broken appliances. I had never seen him dismantled. He looked up at Brooke and asked again, slower this time, whether she submitted those forms, whether she made financial inquiries using assumptions about property she did not own. She tried one last refuge, the language of shared intentions. "I was protecting our future," she said. But something had shifted in Daniel beyond persuasion. He picked up the brokerage inquiry and noticed a detail he had missed in shock. Brooke had listed projected renovation financing tied to anticipated equity access. Renovation financing. Suddenly, the contractor deposit messages, the unexplained loan discussion, all the fragments he had dismissed aligned before him. He stood so abruptly his chair scraped hardwood. "You were borrowing against a future you invented," he said, not loudly, but with the stunned clarity of betrayal recognized too late. Brooke began to cry, though even then I sensed the tears arrived as tactic before grief. Daniel walked into his study and returned with a folder of household accounts. What followed felt less like marital argument than forensic awakening. He discovered credit applications he had only partially reviewed, one tied to a luxury vehicle lease, another involving bridge financing contingent on planned residence transition. Each revelation reduced Brooke not through spectacle, but through exposure. Leonard, before leaving, had quietly instructed Daniel to contact the family bank representative in the morning. By noon the next day, certain joint credit privileges Brooke managed were suspended pending review. 2 days later, the charity board, where she held a visible committee role, received notice of her resignation after concerns about personal financial disclosures surfaced.
No headlines. No scandal parade.
Just doors closing one by one. Reputation rarely collapses with thunder. More often it is withdrawn. Meanwhile, Daniel came to my house every evening that week, sitting at my kitchen table, as though relearning where truth lived. One night, he asked why I had not told him sooner. I stirred tea and said, "Because some truths a mother can only show, not force." He wept then, quietly, the way grown men do when shame outruns words. I did not comfort him immediately. Some grief must finish speaking. Leonard moved next with measured precision. Formal notice was served invoking the Trust Conduct Clause review. Brooke's contingent inheritance expectation through Daniel was suspended. Access to any governance claim over the house terminated. A pending civil complaint regarding unauthorized elder placement representations was prepared but held in reserve, enough to make consequences unmistakable without theatrical ruin. Brooke left the marital home within the month for a furnished apartment near the interstate, the kind leased by executives between permanent addresses. Temporary. How fitting. The last time she came to collect belongings, she paused by my son's front door and said to me, "You destroyed my life over misunderstandings."
Y en suerte, no.
"You gambled your life on entitlement." She had no reply. Weeks later, Daniel invited me to Sunday dinner. He had set the oak table himself, awkwardly but carefully, and pulled out the head chair before I even reached it. Prime rib again of all things. He laughed bitterly at the irony. I did not.
Some symbols are too exact.
As we sat down, he said he had been blind because Brooke translated every slight into practicality until he no longer recognized cruelty when dressed politely. I looked at the empty place where Brooke once presided and understood the story was no longer about surviving humiliation. It was about restored order. Yet one final reckoning remained, because Leonard had one last document Frank intended to be read before all heirs together, and when that document surfaced, Brooke would lose not only standing in this family, but every illusion she had built around what she thought she was owed. October arrived with a brittle wind that sent maple leaves skittering across the porch, and with it came the gathering Leonard had quietly prepared for weeks. He called it a family trust review, though everyone understood it was something closer to judgment. Daniel invited his sister from Cincinnati. Robert came as witness. Margaret arrived carrying a peach cobbler she claimed all serious matters should be accompanied by, and even my grandson appeared subdued in a pressed shirt I had not seen him wear outside funerals. We met in my dining room, not Brooke's, and that mattered. Place carries authority. The oak table held folders instead of china, coffee cups instead of crystal. Leonard waited until everyone sat before opening the final envelope Frank had sealed years ago. "Supplemental letter of intent," he read, his voice calm as winter light. It was Frank speaking from beyond the years in the plain, practical language he favored. He wrote that family wealth was never to reward manipulation, that respect within the household was inseparable from inheritance, and that humiliation of a surviving spouse constituted moral breach, as serious as financial misconduct. Then Leonard produced the addendum no one but he and Frank had known. A legacy reserve, substantial enough to alter lives, had been held outside the known estate for eventual distribution to descendants meeting conduct conditions. Daniel stared. His sister covered her mouth. My grandson whispered, "Granddad did that?" Leonard nodded. Then came the clause Brooke would have traded anything to have seen sooner. Any spouse found complicit in coercion, exploitation, or intentional degradation of the surviving matriarch forfeited all derivative benefit connected to the reserve and triggered exclusion from related family trusts. Forfeited. Such a quiet word for a falling door. Daniel asked if Brooke had any claim left at all through marriage. Leonard answered, "None." Not rhetorical. Legal. Final. There was no triumph in the room, only a strange solemnity, as though Frank himself had just entered and taken his old chair. Yet the sharpest turn came when Daniel, after a long silence, pushed the supplemental documents toward me and said, "Mother, I have let others define your place in this family. That ends here." He proposed then, and they're transferring his contingent management role voluntarily back into a simplified structure under my sole direction, even after my lifetime, so no spouse could ever again leverage proximity into power. My own son was repairing in law what he failed to protect in love. I nearly wept. Leonard finalized notices that week. Brooke's attorneys, after brief bluster, declined contest. There was nothing to contest. The conduct record, witness statements, financial inquiries, and Frank's explicit language made challenge nearly futile. Word traveled in the quiet way communities trade cautionary tales. The country club election Brooke hoped to chair went another direction. The renovation contractor sued for a deposit dispute she could not sustain. Even her social circle thinned once people understood ambition had outrun ethics.
No dramatic ruin.
Just consequence, exact and earned. A month later, Daniel hosted Thanksgiving. This time he insisted I carve the turkey at the head of the table while he stood beside me like an apprentice. During dessert he rose, lifted a water glass, and said before the whole family, "To my mother, whose seat no one will ever move again." Even my grandson stood for that toast. But one last image remains with me. After everyone left, I walked past the old folding TV tray Daniel had brought over from storage, intending to throw it away. I stopped and ran my hand across its chipped edge. Then I folded it shut and leaned it in the pantry. Some relics are not kept out of pain, but proof. Because the woman once sent to dine beside detergent bottles now presided over every document, every asset, every chair at the table. And as Leonard gathered his papers that night, he smiled and said, "Frank built a fortress in fine print." I looked around the room. At family restored under the roof I had nearly been eased out of, and answered, and Brooke mistook a widow for an opening. Still, Leonard had one final administrative act to complete before the year closed, one that would make Brooke's exclusion permanent in county record and family law alike. When that filing posted, even the possibility of her return would disappear. December arrived with a hard blue cold and the kind of clear skies that make every branch look etched in glass. Leonard called 3 days before Christmas and said the county filings were complete. The amended governance structure was recorded. Brooke's derivative claims were extinguished not merely by trust action but by permanent property and estate record annotations tied to the conduct determination. Even if she tried in 10 years, Leonard said, there is no path back through title, succession, or occupancy rights. I thanked him, then stood at my kitchen window watching snow begin in small, deliberate flakes. Strange, the peace that can come from paperwork. People underestimate documents. They can outlast malice. Daniel came over that evening carrying groceries and an awkward solemnity that had become, lately, a form of devotion. He asked if I would consider moving back into the larger family house for a while so it would not feel haunted by what happened. I surprised us both by saying no. I am not reclaiming a house, I told him. I already reclaimed my place. Some victories do not require relocation. Meanwhile, Brooke made one final attempt through a lawyer's letter requesting informal mediation over misunderstandings affecting marital equity. Leonard answered with 3 pages and 8 exhibits. There was no second letter. That silence was its own verdict. News reached us shortly after that Brooke had withdrawn from 2 charitable boards and sold jewelry to settle private obligations linked to the contractor dispute. I took no pleasure in hearing it. Consequence should satisfy justice, not appetite. Yet I would be dishonest if I said there was no deep private relief in watching arrogance meet arithmetic. A week before Christmas, Daniel asked whether I would join him in the old family house for a small supper, just the 2 of us. When I arrived, he had lit candles exactly as Frank used to do, too many perhaps, each one leaning a little because Daniel never did master symmetry. Then he brought from the basement a cardboard box of things Brooke had designated for donation during her decluttering phase. Inside were my old embroidered holiday napkins, Frank's carving set, and beneath them, folded flat, the little TV tray. Daniel looked stricken when he realized what it was. I should have seen, he said. I touched his hand and answered. Now you do. He asked what he should do with it. I told him to set it up. He looked confused but obeyed. I placed on it a single crystal dessert plate and 1 silver spoon from my wedding set. Then I moved it beside the Christmas tree. Let it stand there tonight, I said, as a witness that small humiliations can become the beginning of a reckoning. We ate prime rib because Daniel insisted irony had earned its place. Halfway through dinner, he slid a small velvet box toward me. Inside was a new brass nameplate engraved simply head of table. We both laughed at the drama of it, but he fastened it beneath my chair anyway. Some gestures heal because they verge on absurd and sincerity at once. After supper, he admitted he had filed for divorce the week prior. Not in fury. In clarity. I was married to a version of ambition I mistook for competence, he said. I heard Frank in that sentence. Before I left, Daniel opened the front door for me and said, "Mother, no one will ever seat you outside your own life again." Driving home through falling snow, I realized the story had already ended in every way that mattered. Yet one final Sunday remained, New Year's dinner at my house, when the whole family would gather around my table under a restored order none would challenge. And I knew then the ending would not be spoken in legal language or bitter memory, but in something much simpler. A seat restored, a table reclaimed, and one woman serving the meal, not from exile, but from authority. New Year's Sunday arrived with a kind of sharp winter light that makes even ordinary windows glow. I rose before dawn and prepared dinner in the quiet rhythm that had once defined my happiest years. Prime rib rested in the oven, potatoes roasted in duck fat the way Frank liked, my best china warmed on the sideboard, and at the head of the oak table, beneath the small brass plate Daniel had fastened there, my chair waited where it always should have been. Family arrived just before 4, coats dusted with snow, cheeks pink from the cold, carrying pies and flowers and the awkward tenderness of people who know they are entering a room where something has been repaired. Daniel came first and kissed my forehead before taking his coat off. My grandson asked if he could carve with me later. Even Margaret wore pearls as if attending coronation. We laughed more easily than we had in years. But the final turn came before grace was said. Leonard arrived carrying one last envelope and placed it beside my plate. "Filed Friday," he said simply. "County acknowledgement of Brooks' exclusion, civil complaint withdrawn upon settlement, contractor judgment satisfied by her personal assets, trust protections made permanent." He added almost casually that Brooke had attempted a final challenge through outside counsel and withdrawn when faced with fee exposure and probable sanctions.
"It is over," he said.
Not likely over. Not nearly over. Over. Daniel exhaled as if setting down a stone he had carried for years. Then, before anyone touched the food, he stood and asked permission to read a letter he had written. My son, who once lowered his eyes while his wife sent me to eat beside detergent bottles, now stood before 3 generations and said, "I failed to protect the woman who built the ground under me. I will not fail again." His voice broke only once. No one looked away. Then he turned to the sideboard, lifted something wrapped in linen, and placed it at the center of the table. The old folding TV tray. Restored, polished, absurdly dignified. A ripple of startled laughter moved through the room. Daniel raised a glass and said, "We keep this not as a symbol of insult, but of the moment our family learned what cannot be taken from a woman with self-respect." I touched the tray's edge and felt not pain but completion. During dinner, my grandson, who had once stared at his phone while I sat in the laundry room, leaned over and asked if Granddad really left all those protections because he trusted I would one day need them. I said, he trusted I would know when to use them. That was the truth. Halfway through the meal, the doorbell rang unexpectedly. For a moment, no one moved. Daniel opened the door and returned holding a certified envelope forwarded from Brooks' attorney. He looked at me. I nodded for him to open it. Inside was a signed settlement acknowledgement and a handwritten note from Brooke in 2 brief sentences. "I misjudged you. I thought kindness meant weakness." I did not answer. Some apologies arrived too late to reopen anything. But I folded the note once and set it beside my plate as though filing the last exhibit. After dessert, Leonard asked whether I intended any further action. I looked around the table, at family restored, at my son carving meat under my instruction, at the head chair no longer symbolic but unquestioned, and said, "Justice does not need an encore." That was the last word ever spoken about Brooke in my house. Months later, the laundry room was remodeled into a butler's pantry, though one object remained untouched on a high shelf where guests sometimes noticed it and asked why such a plain old tray was kept among crystal and silver. I always answered the same way. Because it reminds me who owns the table. In spring, Daniel finalized the divorce. The court order left Brooke with none of the property, none of the reserved trust, none of the social standing she once leveraged as entitlement. The charity board replaced her quietly. The club membership lapsed. The luxury lease was gone. Her grand renovation never happened because it had never been hers to imagine. Consequences came not as revenge, but subtraction. And as for me, I did not merely remain in control. I expanded the trust, revised the family governance, and named future protections so no spouse, no child, no one ever again could reduce belonging to convenience. Every Sunday since, dinner begins only when I sit first. Sometimes Daniel still serves prime rib and jokes no meal in this family will ever escape its symbolism. But each time I hear the silver carving knife tap china and watch everyone wait for me to begin, I remember a folding tray beside a dryer and marvel at how badly one woman misunderstood the person she meant to diminish. She thought she had moved me out of the family circle. Instead, she wrote the first line of her own exclusion. She lost money, standing, legal claims, and the house she tried to inherit through humiliation. I regained authority, honor, family, and the head of the table. There was no ambiguity in the ending.
No unfinished wound.
The woman once sent to eat alone in a laundry room now presides over every holiday, every asset, every chair under this roof. And if anyone asks how the story ended, I tell them simply this. She handed me a TV tray. I handed her consequences.